September 8, 1940. Farmingdale, Long Island, New York. Alexander Kartveli stood in the engineering office of Republic Aviation, studying blueprints that covered every surface like fallen snow. Outside, the factory floor hummed with the construction of P-43 Lancers, an adequate fighter that would never be good enough. The specifications from the Army Air Corps lay before him. Requirements for a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, survive combat at altitudes where other aircraft struggled, and return home with battle damage that would destroy lesser machines. The numbers seemed impossible. 8 machine guns, supercharged engine for high-altitude performance, armor protection for the pilot, range exceeding 500 miles. Every requirement added weight, and weight was death to fighter performance. European designers would have declared it unfeasible, would have compromised, would have built something lighter and more maneuverable. Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who understood American industrial capacity in ways European engineers could not, made a different calculation. He would not compromise. He would not make the aircraft lighter. He would make it stronger, heavier, more powerful, and he would trust American factories to build it in numbers that made individual performance almost irrelevant. The Luftwaffe would learn, painfully and slowly, that they were not fighting a fighter aircraft. They were fighting the American economy with wings. The genesis of the P-47 Thunderbolt reflected a uniquely American approach to military aviation, one that European nations, constrained by limited resources and established doctrine, could not replicate. In 1940, as Britain struggled to maintain fighter production and Germany prepared for continental domination, the United States possessed industrial capacity without parallel in human history. American factories produced more steel, more aluminum, more machine tools than all European nations combined. But this capacity had never been fully mobilized for war. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory in 1940 employed approximately 2,500 workers producing fewer than 100 aircraft per month, mostly trainers and light fighters. The facility occupied 90 acres with 500,000 square feet of production space, modern by American standards but modest compared to automotive plants that stretched for miles. What Republic lacked in existing capacity, it possessed in potential: empty land for expansion, access to skilled labor from New York's industrial workforce, proximity to suppliers and subcontractors, and most critically, management that understood mass production. Alexander Kartveli's design philosophy emerged from this environment. European designers optimized for performance with limited production numbers, build the best possible fighter, except that only hundreds or thousands could be manufactured. Kartveli optimized for mass production, build a fighter that American factories could produce in overwhelming numbers, even if individual performance suffered. This meant eliminating complex components, standardizing parts, designing for assembly by semi-skilled workers rather than master craftsmen. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine exemplified this approach. It was not the most advanced engine available. The liquid-cooled Allison and Packard Merlin engines offered better power-to-weight ratios. But the R2800 was simple, rugged, and manufacturable at scale. Pratt & Whitney could produce thousands per month using existing tooling and workforce. The engine's air cooling eliminated vulnerable coolant systems, and its radial configuration distributed damage across multiple cylinders. An engine could lose 2 or 3 cylinders and continue running. The airframe design followed similar logic: heavy use of aluminum alloys rather than exotic materials, straight wings rather than complex elliptical designs, a fuselage that could be built in sections and joined on the assembly line. Everything optimized not for minimum weight or maximum performance, but for maximum producibility. Kartveli calculated that a fighter that could be built in thousands would defeat a superior fighter that could only be built in hundreds. The Luftwaffe would eventually learn he was correct, but the lesson would cost them the war. The transformation of Republic Aviation from a modest aircraft manufacturer to an industrial powerhouse began in earnest in late 1941, accelerating dramatically after Pearl Harbor. The federal government provided capital for factory expansion. The War Production Board allocated steel and aluminum, and skilled workers flooded in from across the Northeast. By mid-1942, the Farmingdale facility had expanded to 1.3 million square feet of production space with over 9,000 workers operating on 3 shifts. But Farmingdale alone could not meet production demands. The Army Air Forces wanted not hundreds of P-47s, but thousands, with delivery schedules that seemed impossible. Republic's solution was audacious: build an entirely new factory from scratch, purpose-designed for P-47 production, in a location that offered unlimited expansion potential. The site selected was Evansville, Indiana, a small city on the Ohio River with access to river transport, railroad connections, and a large pool of underutilized labor. Construction of the Evansville plant began in March 1942. Within 7 months, Republic had erected a facility covering 3.5 million square feet, nearly 3 times larger than the Farmingdale plant, with capacity to employ 20,000 workers. The speed of construction astonished even American standards. Concrete was poured continuously for weeks. Steel framework rose at rates measured in feet per day. Assembly lines were installed while the roof was still being completed overhead. By October 1942, the Evansville plant was producing its first P-47s. The scale of the operation reflected pure American industrial philosophy. At peak production, Evansville alone would employ 25,000 workers building P-47s on assembly lines that stretched the length of multiple football fields. Components arrived from hundreds of subcontractors, engines from Pratt & Whitney facilities in Connecticut, propellers from Curtiss plants in New York, instruments from scattered suppliers across the Midwest. Republic's factories served as final assembly points, integrating components into complete aircraft at rates that increased monthly. German intelligence received reports of this expansion and dismissed them as impossible. No nation could build factories that large that quickly. No industrial system could coordinate production across hundreds of suppliers with such efficiency. The reports must be exaggerated, propaganda designed to intimidate. Luftwaffe planners calculated American fighter production based on European standards, perhaps 300-400 P-47s per month at most. The actual numbers, when they became apparent in combat, would force a terrifying recalculation. The Americans were not building fighters. They were manufacturing them like automobiles, with industrial efficiency that Germany could not match and could not counter. Spring 1943. The first P-47s arrived in England, and German intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photographs of American bases felt the first stirrings of concern. The number of Thunderbolts visible in dispersal areas suggested production rates far higher than estimated. Within weeks, Luftwaffe pilots began encountering P-47s over occupied France, and the tactical reports accumulated with disturbing consistency. The Americans flew formations of 4, 8, 12 aircraft, numbers that suggested not elite squadrons but mass deployment. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, filed a report to Luftflotte 3 headquarters that captured the emerging reality. We are engaging P-47 formations on a daily basis. For every aircraft we destroy, 2 more appear the next day. Our intelligence estimates of American production must be revised upward by a factor of 3 at minimum. We are not fighting a limited deployment of a new fighter type. We are fighting what appears to be unlimited numbers. The German aviation industry, by comparison, operated under constraints unimaginable to American manufacturers. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and other firms competed for limited aluminum allocations, struggled with labor shortages as men were drafted for military service, and faced constant interference from Nazi bureaucracy. Total German fighter production in early 1943 ran approximately 1,000 aircraft per month across all types. This seemed adequate against Britain, which produced similar numbers, and the Soviet Union, whose fighters were individually inferior. But American production operated on a different scale entirely. By spring 1943, Republic Aviation's 2 plants were producing P-47s at a combined rate exceeding 350 aircraft per month, and the rate was increasing. Farmingdale and Evansville together employed over 30,000 workers operating around the clock, with production efficiency improving as workers gained experience. The supply chain functioned with mechanical precision. Pratt & Whitney delivered R-2800 engines at rates matching Republic's assembly capacity, subcontractors met delivery schedules, and the entire system synchronized to deliver complete fighters at ever-increasing rates. Luftwaffe intelligence officers attempting to track American production capacity faced an analytical problem. The numbers they were seeing didn't make sense within their framework of understanding. Germany's entire aviation industry, mobilized for total war, produced fewer fighters than Republic Aviation alone. How could a single American company, in peacetime factories converted to war production, exceed the output of Germany's entire industrial base? The answer, that American industrial capacity dwarfed Germany's, was too disturbing to accept. So they recalculated, revised estimates downward, assured commanders that the numbers were temporary anomalies. They were wrong, and their error would cost Germany the air war. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots manifested gradually through the summer of 1943. It began with small observations. Shot down P-47s replaced within days, damaged aircraft returning to combat with repairs that should have taken weeks, American formations growing larger each month, veteran German pilots, accustomed to fighting outnumbered against the RAF, suddenly found themselves outnumbered against the Americans. The inversion was disorienting. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, a decorated ace with over 100 victories, described the realization in his combat diary. Today, we engaged a formation of 40 P-47s escorting bombers to Wilhelmshaven, 40 fighters for a single bomber formation. We put up 12 FW-190s, every serviceable aircraft in the Staffel. We claimed 3 P-47s destroyed. Tomorrow, the Americans will field 43 P-47s, and we will put up 11, having lost 1 to battle damage. This mathematics is unsustainable. The problem extended beyond simple numbers. German fighters, even when victorious in combat, were being attrited faster than they could be replaced. A Luftwaffe pilot might shoot down a P-47, claim a victory, and feel momentarily successful, but the destroyed P-47 would be replaced within a week, while the ammunition and fuel expended by the German fighter could not be easily replenished. Germany's economy was being strangled by Allied bombing and naval blockade. Critical materials, high-grade aluminum, tungsten for armor-piercing rounds, synthetic rubber, aviation fuel, were becoming scarce. Every combat mission depleted resources that could not be fully restored. The Americans faced no such constraints. P-47 production consumed vast quantities of aluminum, but American aluminum production in 1943 exceeded 1 million tons, more than enough for aircraft, tanks, ships, and every other military requirement. Fuel was unlimited. Ammunition was abundant. Replacement pilots arrived fully trained with hundreds of flight hours. The system was self-sustaining, self-replenishing, immune to attrition. German pilots began to understand they were not fighting a war they could win through superior tactics or courage. They were fighting a system, an industrial system that transformed American economic capacity into military power with terrifying efficiency. The P-47 was merely the visible manifestation of that system, the weapon that American factories could produce faster than German pilots could destroy them. Some pilots, particularly the younger ones who had never known anything but attrition warfare, internalized this as simple fact. Older pilots, who remembered air superiority and victory, found it spiritually crushing. They were not being defeated. They were being drowned in an ocean of aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and pilots, all produced by factories they could not bomb and an economy they could not disrupt. By autumn 1943, Republic Aviation's production had reached 500 P-47s per month and continued climbing. The Evansville plant, now fully operational, had achieved production rates that exceeded initial projections. Assembly line workers, many of whom had never built aircraft before Pearl Harbor, now possessed the efficiency of experienced craftsmen. A P-47 that required 5,000 man-hours to build in early 1942 now required 3,500 man-hours, and the time continued dropping as processes were refined. The factory floor at Evansville operated with the precision of industrial choreography. The fuselage assembly line stretched over 200 feet, with stations every 40 feet where specific tasks were performed. Workers installed cockpit instruments at Station 7, electrical systems at Station 9, fuel lines at Station 12. Each task was timed, optimized, simplified to require minimum training. A worker who had been a truck driver 3 months earlier now installed hydraulic actuators with the confidence of long practice. Wing assembly occurred on parallel lines, with left and right wings built simultaneously and married to fuselages at the main junction point. The R-2800 engines arrived from Pratt & Whitney already mounted on engine mounts, complete units that could be hoisted and bolted onto the airframe in under 2 hours. Propellers, gun mounts, armor plates, everything was pre-assembled to maximize efficiency. At the end of the line, complete P-47s rolled out at a rate of 3 per day per assembly line. Evansville operated 4 lines. The economic implications were staggering. A P-47 cost approximately $85,000 to produce, expensive by American standards, roughly equivalent to 17 Jeeps or 2 Sherman tanks. But the cost was manageable within American military budgets that measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Germany's entire military budget for 1943 was less than the United States spent on aircraft production alone. The economic disparity meant that even if German pilots achieved favorable kill ratios, destroying 2 P-47s for every German fighter lost, they would still lose the attrition battle. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, studying captured P-47s, marveled at the construction quality. Every rivet was precisely placed. Every weld was perfect. Every component met exacting specifications. This was not the rushed production of a nation struggling to meet demands. This was industrial precision at scale, the application of American mass production techniques to military aviation. A German engineer examining a captured P-47 reportedly remarked, "This is not an aircraft. This is what happens when automobile manufacturers build fighters, and we cannot compete with automobile manufacturers." He was correct. Germany had excellent aircraft designers. America had Ford, General Motors, and an industrial base that could outproduce the rest of the world combined. Winter 1943-1944 brought the strategic bombing campaign to full intensity, and with it the realization among Luftwaffe commanders that they faced an impossible defensive mission. American bomber formations, each protected by dozens of P-47 escorts, struck German industrial targets with increasing frequency and accuracy. The defenders achieved tactical successes. Bomber formations suffered losses. P-47s were shot down, but the strategic battle was being lost. Major Günther Specht, a logistics officer attached to Luftwaffe High Command, compiled a report that captured the mathematical reality. In December 1943, German fighter forces destroyed approximately 180 American aircraft over Western Europe, bombers and fighters combined. This represented significant casualties by any standard. But American production that same month delivered over 3,000 new aircraft to operational units. The loss rate was under 6%. Germany could not sustain 6% losses in any category. America could sustain and replace them indefinitely. The report went further, analyzing pilot production. Germany graduated approximately 2,500 fighter pilots per year from training programs that had been cut from 18 months to 12 months to 6 months as demands increased. The United States graduated over 50,000 pilots annually from training programs that remained at 18 months, producing pilots with 400-plus hours of flight time, twice what German pilots received. Even in pilot production, the Americans achieved overwhelming advantage through industrial-scale training systems. The psychological impact on German commanders manifested as fatalism. Oberst Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, met with Hermann Göring to present the situation. The conversation, later documented by multiple participants, revealed the cognitive dissonance at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Galland explained that German fighter forces were being systematically destroyed through attrition. Göring responded that this was impossible. German pilots were superior, German aircraft were better, therefore Germany must be winning. Galland attempted to explain production disparities. Göring declared the intelligence must be wrong, that American production claims were propaganda. The meeting ended with Göring ordering increased aggression, more fighting spirit, greater dedication to the Führer. No mention of how fighting spirit would conjure additional aircraft, fuel, or ammunition. Galland left the meeting understanding that rational discussion was impossible. The Nazi leadership had built a worldview where German superiority was axiomatic, and evidence to the contrary was rejected as defeatism or enemy propaganda. This intellectual failure, more than any tactical mistake, doomed the Luftwaffe. They could not defeat an opponent they refused to honestly assess. And the P-47s kept coming, wave after wave, built by factories that operated beyond the reach of German bombers and beyond the comprehension of German planners. Spring 1944. Republic Aviation's production peaked at 650 P-47s per month, more than the entire German fighter production for several months that year. The scale of American industrial mobilization had reached levels that seemed almost surreal. Evansville employed 25,000 workers. Farmingdale employed 15,000. Together, they consumed aluminum at rates that would have sustained all German aircraft production with capacity to spare. And this was just one fighter type. American factories simultaneously produced P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, B-17 and B-24 bombers, transport aircraft, trainers in numbers that staggered comprehension. The transformation of American society to achieve this production was comprehensive. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of female factory workers who built the aircraft that won the war. At Republic's Evansville plant, women composed over 40% of the workforce, operating machinery, assembling components, performing quality control inspections. The social implications would reverberate for decades, but in 1944 the focus was purely practical. America needed workers. Women could do the work. Therefore, women worked. The supply chain extended across the nation. Aluminum came from smelters powered by hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest and Tennessee Valley. Pratt & Whitney engines were built in Connecticut factories that operated 24 hours a day. Instruments came from dozens of manufacturers across the Midwest. Landing gear, hydraulics, electrical systems, thousands of components from hundreds of suppliers, all synchronized through coordination that itself represented an industrial achievement. The logistics alone, ensuring the right parts arrived at the right factories at the right time, required computational capacity that pushed American organizational systems to their limits. German attempts to disrupt this production through sabotage or long-range bombing proved futile. The factories were too dispersed, too far from German bases, too well defended. American industrial capacity existed in a sanctuary beyond Luftwaffe reach, producing weapons that would be employed thousands of miles from their origin. This geographic advantage, the immunity of American production from enemy attack, represented strategic dominance that no tactical brilliance could overcome. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, flying defensive missions over Munich, later recalled seeing P-47 formations that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. I counted 40, 50, 60 aircraft. Then I stopped counting. What was the point? We had 8 fighters serviceable. They could have destroyed us with 1/10 their force and still accomplished their mission. We were not fighting. We were bearing witness to our own defeat, watching it arrive wave after wave, each wave built by factories we could not reach, flown by pilots we could not kill fast enough, supported by an economy we could not match. The convergence of American industrial power and European combat reached its apex in the summer of 1944. The D-Day invasion required absolute air superiority over the Normandy beaches, and P-47 groups provided much of that superiority. On June 6, 1944, over 1,000 P-47 sorties were flown in support of the landings, protecting bombers, strafing German positions, intercepting Luftwaffe counterattacks. German fighter response was negligible, not because German pilots lacked courage, but because the Luftwaffe had been ground down through months of attrition against American industrial capacity. The numbers told the story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe could field approximately 1,500 single-engine fighters on the Western Front. By June, despite desperate production efforts, that number had dropped to under 400 serviceable aircraft. German losses exceeded production. Pilot casualties exceeded training output. Fuel shortages limited operations. The systematic destruction of German aviation industry through Allied bombing meant that even aircraft that could be assembled often lacked engines, instruments, or weapons. The Luftwaffe was being dismantled by attrition warfare, and American P-47 production was the cutting blade. Republic Aviation, unaware and unconcerned with daily combat results, maintained production schedules with mechanical precision. The Evansville plant set a record in June 1944. 528 P-47s delivered in a single month from one factory. Farmingdale contributed another 245. Together, the two plants produced more fighters in 1 month than Germany's entire aviation industry produced across all types. And this was sustainable. Not a surge, but steady-state production that could continue indefinitely. The German response to this industrial tsunami revealed the desperation of their position. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf received orders to increase fighter production by any means necessary. Corners were cut. Quality control was reduced. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines with defects that would have been unacceptable months earlier. Pilots received aircraft with unreliable radios, poorly synchronized guns, engines prone to overheating. These were not precision weapons, but desperate attempts to maintain numerical strength against overwhelming odds. The contrast with American production was stark. P-47s arrived at operational units in perfect condition, every system tested, every weapon calibrated, every component meeting specifications. American pilots trusted their aircraft completely because American factories built to standards that never compromised. This reliability itself was a weapon, translating into higher sortie rates, better combat effectiveness, superior pilot morale. German pilots flew aircraft that might fail mechanically before encountering the enemy. American pilots flew aircraft that survived combat damage and mechanical stress that would destroy German fighters. The industrial disparity had become a combat multiplier that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Autumn 1944. The preparation for the final campaigns into Germany required air superiority so complete that German fighters could not effectively operate. American strategy was explicit: destroy the Luftwaffe through systematic attrition, targeting not just aircraft but production facilities, fuel supplies, and pilot training programs. The P-47 was instrumental in executing this strategy, not through dramatic aerial victories but through relentless presence. Every day, weather permitting, hundreds of P-47s flew over Germany. They escorted bombers to targets. They strafed airfields. They attacked trains carrying aviation fuel. They pursued German fighters that attempted to take off, catching them in their most vulnerable moments. The effect was cumulative. German pilots could not train without risking attack, could not fly to forward bases without being intercepted, could not concentrate forces without being discovered and engaged. The Luftwaffe was being pinned to the ground by aircraft that existed in such numbers that avoiding them became impossible. Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft, a veteran of Spain and the Eastern Front, attempted to explain the situation to younger pilots. "We are not losing because they are better pilots. We are losing because they are everywhere. You take off, they are above you. You land, they are attacking the field. You attempt to regroup, they are waiting. There is no sanctuary, no rest, no moment when you are not either fighting or preparing to fight. And they have fuel for continuous operations while we ration every liter." The fuel crisis particularly crippled German operations. American bombers had systematically destroyed synthetic fuel plants, and Romania's oil fields, Germany's last major petroleum source, had been captured by Soviet forces. Luftwaffe units received fuel allocations measured in hours of flight time per week. Training was impossible. Even combat operations were limited to emergencies. Pilots sat in cockpits watching American formations pass overhead, unable to take off because fuel had to be saved for more critical missions that never seemed to arrive. Meanwhile, American logistics supplied P-47 groups with unlimited fuel. Tanker trucks delivered aviation gasoline to forward bases in quantities that German logistics officers would have considered impossible. American pilots flew multiple missions per day. 4 or 5 sorties were common, sustained by supply chains that functioned with industrial efficiency. A P-47 group consumed more fuel in a day than an entire German fighter wing received in a week. This disparity, more than any technical advantage, determined the outcome. The Americans could fight continuously. The Germans could barely fight at all. And the gap widened daily as American production continued, while German capacity collapsed under Allied bombing. December 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's final major attack, required air support the Luftwaffe could no longer provide. Every serviceable fighter was committed, pilots flew missions on minimal fuel, and for a few days German aircraft appeared over the battlefield in numbers not seen since 1943. The effort was unsustainable. Within a week, fuel reserves were depleted, aircraft losses exceeded replacements, and the skies returned to Allied dominance. The P-47's role in defeating the Ardennes offensive demonstrated the aircraft's evolution into a multi-role weapon. Initially designed for high-altitude bomber escort, by late 1944, the P-47 had become equally effective as a ground attack fighter. Its 850 caliber machine guns could destroy soft targets. Its robust airframe could carry bombs and rockets while retaining fighter performance. Its ability to absorb ground fire made it survivable in low-altitude attack roles. And most critically, there were enough P-47s to simultaneously provide air superiority and close air support, the luxury of numbers that German forces could not match. American pilots flew close support missions that destroyed German armor and supply columns with methodical efficiency. They operated in teams, some aircraft providing high cover against German fighters, others attacking ground targets, all coordinating through radio communications that German forces could only envy. When German fighters appeared, the high cover engaged them while ground attack aircraft either continued their mission or withdrew and returned when the sky was clear. The tactical flexibility was overwhelming. Hauptmann Georg Schroeder, flying ground attack missions in a FW-190F, encountered P-47s attacking German positions near Bastogne. His after-action report captured the futility. We attempted to intercept 8 P-47s bombing our supply columns. Before we could engage, 12 more P-47s dove on us from altitude. We broke off attack, lost 2 aircraft, accomplished nothing. The Americans resumed bombing as if we had never been there. This happened 3 times in one day. They have so many aircraft they can afford to use fighters as bombers while other fighters protect the bombers that used to be fighters. We have barely enough aircraft to attempt interception, and even when we try, we fail because they have reserves, and we do not. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Republic Aviation had produced over 15,000 P-47s by the end of 1944. Thousands were operational in Europe. German fighter production for all of 1944 totaled approximately 25,000 aircraft across all types, but combat losses exceeded 15,000. The Germans were losing the war of production, and production determined everything else. The final months of the war brought not dramatic battles but systematic destruction. Allied air forces operated with such complete dominance that German aircraft rarely appeared. Not because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed, several thousand fighters remained operational, but because fuel shortages, parts shortages, and overwhelming Allied numbers made effective operations impossible. German fighters sat on airfields, camouflaged and dispersed, unable to fly for lack of fuel or ammunition or purpose. The P-47 groups, by contrast, flew continuously. The Evansville and Farmingdale plants maintained production through early 1945, delivering aircraft that arrived in Europe to find that existing forces already exceeded operational requirements. Some newly produced P-47s were placed directly into storage, held as reserves against possible losses that never materialized. This absurd abundance, producing fighters faster than combat could consume them, represented the ultimate expression of American industrial dominance. Franz Steigler, who had survived the war through skill and luck, flew his final mission in March 1945. His unit received fuel for one last sortie, a mission to intercept Allied bombers approaching Munich. He took off knowing the mission was pointless, that they would be outnumbered, that survival was unlikely. The bombers appeared with an escort of what looked like 50 P-47s. Stigler's formation of 8 German fighters attempted one attacking pass and was immediately engaged by P-47s that seemed to appear from every direction. He watched 2 of his wingmen die in the first 30 seconds, broke off engagement, and fled. Landing with his fuel tanks nearly empty, Stigler wrote in his logbook, "The Americans have won, not because they are better pilots, though many are very good, not because their aircraft is superior, though the P-47 is formidable. They won because they built 10,000 of them and we could not. They won because American factories produced fighters faster than we could destroy them, trained pilots faster than we could kill them, delivered fuel and ammunition in unlimited quantities while we scrounged for every liter and every round. We lost an industrial war. Our courage was irrelevant. Our skill was insufficient. Our production could not match theirs. This is what defeat looks like. Not dramatic battles, but quiet recognition that the enemy can simply outlast you." Republic Aviation's production records showed total P-47 production exceeded 15,600 aircraft by war's end. German intelligence had estimated American P-47 production would peak at 3,000 total. They were wrong by a factor of 5, and that miscalculation, repeated across every category of military production, determined the outcome of the war. May 1945. Victory in Europe. The final accounting revealed the magnitude of American industrial achievement. Republic Aviation had produced 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts in less than 4 years. These aircraft had flown 546,000 combat sorties, claimed 3,152 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat, destroyed thousands of ground targets, and accomplished their primary mission, protecting American bombers that systematically dismantled German industry and military capacity. But the numbers, impressive as they were, understated the true achievement. The P-47 represented not just an aircraft, but a system, an industrial system that integrated design, production, logistics, training, and tactical employment into a coherent whole. Alexander Kartveli had designed a fighter that American factories could mass produce. Republic Aviation had built those factories and trained the workers. The Army Air Forces had developed doctrine that exploited the aircraft's strengths. American pilots had executed that doctrine with discipline and effectiveness, and American industry had sustained the entire enterprise with resources that seemed unlimited compared to German scarcity. The German failure was not primarily tactical or even strategic. It was analytical. German planners had fundamentally misunderstood the type of war they were fighting. They believed World War II would be decided by tactical excellence, technological innovation, and warrior spirit, the factors that had determined previous conflicts. They did not grasp that industrial warfare at global scale was fundamentally different, that victory would belong to the nation that could mobilize its economy most effectively. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the physical manifestation of this misunderstanding. German pilots shot down P-47s, claimed victories and felt momentarily successful, then watched more P-47s arrive, and more, in numbers that rendered individual victories strategically meaningless. They were fighting aircraft built by the Evansville plant, and the Evansville plant built them faster than German pilots could destroy them. This was the essential equation of the air war, and it admitted no solution that German forces could implement. The true measure of the P-47's success was not how many German fighters it destroyed, but how completely it controlled European airspace. By war's end, German aircraft could not operate during daylight. They could not train pilots effectively. They could not protect their cities from bombing. They could not support ground forces. Air superiority had been achieved not through tactical dominance, but through industrial exhaustion, the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority until the opponent simply could not continue fighting. The American factories had built a monster the Luftwaffe couldn't stop, because the Luftwaffe was fighting not an aircraft, but an economic system that outproduced Germany across every measure that mattered. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately the story of American industrial capitalism applied to total war. The aircraft succeeded, not because it was the finest fighter ever built. By many technical measures, it was not. It succeeded because it was exactly the fighter American industry could produce in overwhelming numbers, with reliability and consistency that sustained combat operations at scales unprecedented in military history. Republic Aviation's achievement extended beyond the specific aircraft. The company had demonstrated that American industrial methods, mass production, standardization, vertical integration, systematic training, could be applied to military aviation with devastating effectiveness. The P-47 production line at Evansville became a model for post-war aircraft manufacturing, influencing how nations around the world would organize defense production for decades to come. For the Luftwaffe, the P-47 represented a lesson learned too late and at catastrophic cost. German aviation industry had optimized for quality over quantity, building excellent aircraft in limited numbers. This approach worked when Germany fought nations with similar industrial constraints. Britain, France, the Soviet Union in 1941. It failed completely against American industrial capacity, which could produce adequate aircraft in numbers that made quality differentials irrelevant. By the time German planners understood this reality, they lacked the industrial base, resources, and time to adapt. The human dimension cannot be forgotten. Over 15,000 American pilots flew P-47s in combat. Hundreds died. Thousands survived battles they might not have survived in less rugged aircraft, returned home after the war, and lived full lives because American factories had built a fighter that prioritized pilot protection. The decision to make the P-47 heavy, armored, and survivable, the decision that British analysts initially called inefficient, saved thousands of American lives. This represented a profound philosophical difference between Allied and Axis approaches to warfare. The Allies treated pilots as valuable assets to be protected. The Axis treated them as expendable resources. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat missions in 1955, serving with air forces around the world long after World War II ended. Republic Aviation continued building fighters through the 1960s, applying lessons learned from P-47 production to new generations of aircraft. The factory workers at Evansville and Farmingdale moved on to other industries, carrying skills learned building fighters into peacetime production. But the essential lesson remained. In industrial age warfare, victory belongs to the nation that can most effectively transform economic capacity into military power. American factories built a monster the Luftwaffe couldn't stop, and in doing so, demonstrated that modern war is won not on battlefields but in factories, Not by heroes but by workers. Not through courage but through production. The P-47 proved it. History recorded it. And no nation that understood this lesson would ever be defeated by one that did not.